Oh, friends, good morning. What a joy it is to be here and to share in the goodness of God. Let us hear these words this morning from Scripture, from the Gospel of Matthew we read. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. That thing that he had heard was that John the Baptist had been murdered. And so he went to draw apart to a deserted place. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, and he cured the sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the village and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing but 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and he blessed and he broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Oh, the word of the Lord has so many wonderful things and wonderful stories that teach us about God. This story in particular teaches us about God's love, God's provision, God's character as a God who, through Jesus Christ, loves God's people, even their most immediate needs. We are in the midst of this series on Beyond Our Borders, where last week we talked about Mozambique, and this week we're talking about Nicaragua. And it's always in this feeding miracle that when Jesus feeds the 5,000, that there are many things that come to mind. The first thing that comes to mind is all of a sudden I'm 6 or 7 again as I hear it read. And I'm sitting in the little Sunday school class at the little table in the downstairs area of the little church I went to as a kid. And the Sunday school teacher has a flannel board, because that was high tech then, right? Flannel board with cutouts, and puts people up there, and the little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and then you see the multitudes of the crowds of the people, and then lots and lots of baskets, 12 baskets of food that's left overflowing to show that miracle. There are so many things that I love about this story, but one of those things is that I love the fact that God seems to use what's already available to create the miracle. God uses what's already there to multiply it. I look at the stories throughout the Scripture, and that's the way it is. God could have had a huge feast. Could he not? Could have had an assortment of food, all of rich and delicious flavors, and all kinds of different meats and breads and whatnot, because it's God, right? God doesn't do that. Just like when the people of Israel have left Egypt and they're traveling in the desert, those 40 years wandering to get to the promised land. God provides manna on the ground, which seems to grow from the dew. He provides quail and water for them to drink, water that comes from the rock. God uses what's available for the miracle. Throughout the Scripture story, we see it again and again. In Elisha, we see the widow who Elisha asks, "What do you have?" And she said, "Well, I have this jar of oil." And from that oil comes more and more and more vessels full of oil. God used what she already had in her house to provide. And in this story, God uses somebody else's lunch, somebody else's picnic, to feed over 5,000 people. But here's the other thing that happens in this miracle that I love. And it goes to great detail to describe it. After Jesus blesses the fish and the loaves, he gives it to the disciples to distribute. He gives it back to the disciples. The disciples give it to him. He blesses it. He gives it back to the disciples, and the disciples distribute it. You see, I believe that God still does that today, that God gives us gifts and miracles. God gives us hope. God gives us all kinds of different gifts. And what we are called to do as the disciples of Jesus is to share them with others. I read a book once by a gentleman who, I think it was called The Upside Down Gospel. And he wrote in it, he talked about the different parables, and he just said, what if, he postulates with a number of different parables, what if the real miracle of the story was not that the food multiplied, but that everybody had more than 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, that there was a lot of food in the midst of the crowd that day. But instead of everybody holding on to what was theirs, everybody gave it away. And I asked the question, would it make it any less of a miracle? And somebody said yes. And I think, well, maybe in that culture where hospitality was key, maybe that would be the case. But in today's world, I'm not so sure that if you had 5,000 people that were hungry and were worried about themselves and how they were going to get their family back home and have enough, would they share what they had if they weren't sure they would get any more? I don't know. But I do believe this. I believe that God gives us things and every day. You see, and I think we shortchange those things when really we should think more highly of them. So for example, it's the person that gives up a sense of their well-being so somebody else can have some. I think that's a miracle. It's the person who gives up some of their sense of safety and security and gives it to somebody else so that that person can feel safe and secure. It's when somebody who has privilege and power, I have privilege and power, friends, I know I do, when that is used then to give voice to somebody who doesn't have any or has very little, that is a gift. And I believe it's what God calls us to do. You see, I believe that the indwelling of Jesus Christ in our lives causes us to have to live and want to live differently. It becomes not about us, but it becomes all about God and what God desires from us and who God calls us to be. And it calls us outside of ourselves and into the world. And it might take a little bit of our sense of well-being. It might even take a little bit of our sense of safety and security. It might even take a little bit of our power. And yet, I believe that is what God calls us to. Just as Jesus was poured out for so many, I believe that God is calling us to that today, to allow our lives to be poured out for others. It's a lot easier said than done. So a couple years ago, I was appointed to my first church just south of here. And I was there one day when I got a phone call from my home church, which is Woods Chapel in Lee Summit. My home church, where the pastor then was Pastor Jeff Brinkman. And Pastor Jeff said, Stacie, why don't you come along with us on our trip to Nicaragua? He said, I'm taking some pastors and I'm taking a group from our church and we're dedicating a housing project that we've built in our sister church of Los Pinos. We're going to go dedicate 25 houses, but along the way we'll take you on a trip and you'll get to see a bunch of different villages and just come. And I'm so glad that I didn't think about it more than 20 minutes before I bought my plane ticket, because I might have backed out, because I don't always like to give away that sense of well-being. And traveling that far away from my family was a little bit of a heartache for me and a little difficult, but I didn't think about it much, so I just did it. And once you put down that much money to pay for a trip, for a flight, you can't back out. You're in. And that's exactly what happened. And it changed my life. You were waiting for that, right? And it changed my life. Because while I have spent my life in social services here in Missouri, I have never witnessed the things that I witnessed when I went to Nicaragua. In terms of the people, in terms of their generosity, and in terms of people that work harder day in and day out than I have ever seen anybody work. And all I wanted to do was to continue to figure out how can I be a part of making a difference. And so on that trip, one of the things that I did was I went back to Kansas City just a few times so that I could meet with the group that was going. So I could meet with the folks from that church that were going. Some of them I had known. And so I was excited to reconnect. But what came across in all those meetings that I went to was the level of relationship that the people of Woods Chapel had with Los Pinos. The level of relationship. They would talk about all of those who had babies since the last time they'd been there. And then they'd fight about who got to hold the baby. And then they'd talk about those who had passed, and those who wouldn't be there, and those who'd gotten a new job, and those kids that were getting ready to graduate, and on and on and on it went. They knew that community, and they knew the people. And it wasn't about us and them. It was just all about us. And so I was very intrigued. And so Megan Munzlinger was the person that showed us around on my very first go and see trip. And I'm excited to have Megan here today from Rainbow Network. Megan is here to just give us a little information, and we thought we'd just sit down and be comfortable today and kind of share just some information about the Rainbow Network, about what you all are doing in Nicaragua, and how we can be a part of it. So, Megan, tell me about the vision of Rainbow Network.
Rainbow Network was founded by a Springfield couple, Keith and Karen Jaspers, and they both came from humble backgrounds. And they felt like if they ever came into wealth, that they should share it. And so as they started businesses, they got involved in missions. And Keith eventually ended up on the International Board for Habitat for Humanity. And as he traveled the world, dedicating these homes and seeing families sign their contract for payment of the house that they had helped build, but were soon to be living in, he knew that they had no way of paying that loan. He saw families that were chronically ill that had no access to health care. Very few of the people could read or write. And so he just saw that it was so much more than housing. And so after a lot of prayer, he really put together the vision of Rainbow Network, whose mission is to share the love of Christ with Nicaragua's poorest people in programs in healthcare, education, economic development, and housing. But he knew most importantly that it was not going to change anything if it relied on you and me being there to do the work for the people, but how do we empower the people through each of these programs to really be the hands and feet of the change. And so he kind of started as a hobby in 5 different communities, and now we are in 112 today.
So tell us a little bit more about how it works.
So we will, when we have the ability and we feel like God is really calling us to expand into an area, we'll go, and our local staff in Nicaragua, who are all Nicaraguans, they will spend countless hours out there getting to know the people in the community, getting to know what their health care, what their education, what their economic development, what their housing situations are, and really assessing those and looking at how we can partner with them, looking at their desire to partner with us, those sorts of things. And so we'll spend several trips out to those areas, getting to know the people. And then we will call town hall meetings, and we'll have 2, 3, sometimes even 5 of those, talking to the people about their situations, talking about what we do. And then eventually we'll get to a point where we'll hold an election and they will vote on whether or not they would like us to come into their community, and whether or not they are willing to take on that challenge of being the hands and feet of the work that's happening in that community. We've never been turned away. As you can imagine, people lack opportunity. That's what poverty is. And so they just want that opportunity to get one step ahead. And so once they invite us in, then we'll hold additional elections, and they will vote for somebody to be in charge of their health care or their medical clinics, in charge of their feeding centers, in charge of their primary schools, their high school scholarships. People are in charge of loans, their housing situations, all sorts of things. And then our local staff will work closely with that committee of leaders, teaching them why. Why do we do what we do the way that we do it? Why is this important? Talking to them about casting that vision of what their community could be, how working together is really the key to changing that, and just educating them along the way on how to run each of those programs.
One of the things that people ask all the time is, why global? I mean, there's so many needs right here in our community. Why go outside of our borders? Why go beyond our borders?
First of all, I feel God has called us to do that. He's called us to meet the needs of the people here in Springfield. He's called us to meet them in Missouri, the U.S., but also the world. And so, just as you talked about, we all work together, and we all fill in each other's weaknesses. People are called to local, people are called to international. God calls us to each and every part of his work, and so I feel like that is truly important. In Nicaragua specifically, there are no government programs to help the people in these rural communities, and so without Rainbow Network being there, there are no opportunities for them to seek medical care, and so you have people dying of simple illnesses. There are no opportunities for them to earn an education or to have an ongoing business, or to overcome the living conditions. If you saw the shack out in the gathering center, no opportunities for them to overcome that without just the hand up that Rainbow Network provides with them.
So our church throughout the years has done a number of things with Rainbow Network. There's a lot of folks here that you said we have 40 that are sponsoring students here. So there are 40 people that are sponsoring students over in, or 40 students that are being sponsored by folks here at Wesley. But then we also have our medical missions that goes every year with Dr. Will Moore, and they do medical missions. And I understand in the past we've done some building projects, some construction projects with folks in a variety of communities. Tell me, how do churches though partner with a specific village like Woods Chapel did with Los Pinos?
This has been ever evolving. We used to do just the go and see trips that were 2 or 3 days, or we used to do just the medical or just a construction trip. And as you visit those communities, as our staff visits those communities afterwards, people are left longing to know what happened to those people that came and met them that week. Why didn't they love me enough to come back? And so you build these relationships, and it kind of drops off after that. And it's the same for us here. After we come back from a trip, you may or may not have a clue what happens to that person afterwards. And so we've found just this deep connection as we've started partnering communities with churches, to where it almost becomes family, and those communities know what's going on in the church. The church knows the new babies, and they know the deaths, and they know all of these things. As we get out of the vans, when we show up to some of these communities, it's hard to even make it to the welcoming little celebration, because people are just bombarded with hugs and kisses, and just the families wanting to share what they have been doing over the last few months since the last group was there, because they're so proud of what their community is doing together and the change that's taking place.
Tell us more about Pancorba. I know that you've been prayerful about selecting for Wesley a specific village that we could partner with. So tell us about Pancorba.
Pancorba is a community. It's about an hour east of the west coast of Nicaragua, near a larger city called La Paz Centro. And it has 85 families, or about 300 people. 100 of those people are children. They don't have medical care without Rainbow Network sending a doctor out there. And so our doctor is showing up every 2 weeks right now to see these people and treat their illnesses. They have to walk 4 kilometers to the nearest primary school, and so either a parent has to walk them to school, which most likely isn't happening, and so they aren't going to school at all. So it's basically a community of illiterate people. So what we have done is we've set up 4 basically one-room schoolhouses throughout that community, dispersed throughout different parts of it, and children are able to go there and learn to read and write. They're learning Spanish, they're learning mathematics, and they're learning Bible, or holding Bible studies with those children. They are getting feeding centers in those communities, often tied with the education program, where children are getting one good meal per day. We are working with families and teaching them how to run small businesses with the help of a loan. Many of them have never seen more than $20 or $30 at a time, and so teaching them to manage money, how to pay back a loan, how to market their products, whether they're running a store in their home, whether they're buying and selling grains, whether they're buying and selling animals. It's really dependent on what they have the desire to do. We will work with them and teach them how to be successful in that. And then the community does not have fresh drinking water, and so there is a river that runs through the community that the families they are washing their clothes there, they're bathing there, they are getting water for their animals, they're doing, some of them are probably drinking from there still. If they want clean drinking water, they have to walk 5 kilometers to the nearest well. And so it's just a very harsh community that's been overcome with poverty. And one of the things with with poverty, when we first start in communities, we see high rates of gastritis. And that's just from the stress of everyday life, that these families don't know where their next meal is going to come from. They don't know how they're going to take care of their sick child. They don't know how they're going to survive. And so that's the community of Pancorva today. We have just recently begun working in that community, so it's still very fresh, very raw, and the community is still learning to work together. They're still learning how to run each of these programs, but they're starting to see those small successes, and they're starting to feel that hope that things can get better.
I think one of the things that we've talked about is that you can't put a price on the relationship building aspect. There's nothing that can replace that ability to build relationships. One of the stories that was most heartening to me was when I traveled to Los Pinos for the housing dedication. I heard the story of a woman named Margene. Margene had a liver disease, and she was being treated by our Wesley medical team. I had no idea that connection, but they were getting her meds for her liver disease. Margene was very instrumental in getting those first houses. She really wanted housing, and she was part of those original conversations about her community and really wanted to see that housing take place. She passed away just before that housing dedication, and there was much conversation in those pre-trips meetings about Margene and her family. And however, what was most touching to me was when we got to Los Pinos, some of the very first people to meet us at the van was Margene's mom and her family that came and welcomed us. And her mom said, and I heard this, the translator told us, "I've been waiting for my pastor and my church people to get here." And so that was a moment that I will not forget, because that spoke volumes to me about what it truly means to build relationship with people, that in the joy and in the grief, that we truly are not, it's not us and them, it's about all of us. So that's really, really important. Sorry.
Yep, we have a box of Kleenex. This is up here for a reason. Margene was a good friend. One of the things that always touched me was, you hear, and we've talked about, Nicaraguans are very hardworking people that just lack the opportunity that they need to get ahead. And each time that we visited Los Pinos, Margene was one of the first people to greet you when you got out of the van, and she was never giving a sob story about her medical condition, but she wanted us to understand what was happening in her community, the good, the bad, everything, because she knew that God was in charge. She knew that changes were happening, and she had hope that that would happen. And through each of that, she would tell her story, and then she would say that through all of this, God had never forgotten her, and Rainbow Network had never forgotten her. Well, you guys have been a part of that, and so that's you too. And so that's what this is all about. We don't need to be doing these things for the people. We are going to love them. We're going to encourage them. If you think about a bad day that you have, you just really want to hug. And that's what these families have this deep desire to do as well. And as you build this relationship with Pancorva, it's going to feel like that family that you want to go give that hug on that sad day, and you want to grieve with. You want to celebrate when the students are graduating. You want to celebrate in each of these successes. So that's really what it's all about to me.
Now, Megan is out in the gathering area, and if you haven't been there, I want you to make sure that you go out there and check that out, because all the students that she has, if you're interested in sponsoring a student for education, they're all from Pancorva. So, and we want to go, don't we, Megan? We want to go. We want to go do a go and see trip, and we'd like to do that in February. I'd like to lead that trip, and Megan's agreed to really be the leader, teach me how to do this. But we would like to go, and we'd like to go visit Pancorva and begin building those relationships so that we can really understand what people are needing. And so we are going to do that in February. So if you've got a little heartburn right now, thinking, oh, I'd love to do that, do not hesitate. But before you leave today, sign up that you're interested in our trip to Pancorva. And we hope that there will be many, many more in the years to come. We know there will be many, many more in the years to come as we begin to develop those relationships. So we invite you to sign up for that if you're interested, and then you'll be hearing more about Pancorva throughout the coming year as we take on this partnership. Tell them just briefly, because we just have a couple minutes, but tell them really what does it cost to sponsor a village for a year?
A village to sponsor all the medical care, the feeding center, to provide the supplies for the primary schools, and then also help get some of those loans started for families to start small businesses, runs about $20,000 per year, which seems like such a big number, but when you break it down to 300 people that is providing all of these services for, it's really a drop in the bucket.
Yeah. So today, we just invite you to think about what it means to reach out and to be a part of the blessing that God has given each one of us, and what it means to be a blessing by sharing our blessing with others. So thank you, Megan, for bringing us the information, and let's give Megan a round of applause.
Thank you.